And another question from the audience. How different were the incarceration camps from the assembly centers?
I couldn't answer that at all, not having, in fact, I don't remember anything about the assembly center at all. But we were in Fresno, not Tulare, and a lot of the people in Fresno ended up in Jerome. So that's all I can remember.
The assembly centers as opposed to the camps. Okay. I know that my mom went to Tanforan racetrack, and I remember she talked about smelling the horse manure. They had to sleep on hay. I guess maybe mattresses stuffed with hay. So it was pretty awful. So compared to the assembly centers, Topaz, the concentration camp was like really nice because they had actually, they lived in a room. What is it, like a big cabin? And they had showers. I think they were community showers, I don't know. But the difference is, instead of sleeping in a horse stall, they got to sleep in a room.
My family's first encounter was the Fresno Fairgrounds. And the barracks that they made, they weren't closed for each section. So if we lived in one section and another family lived in another section in the same area, we could hear them. So the assembly in Fresno wasn't very nice because, as you say, the horse stalls were the main places where we had to stay, and they also built other ones real fast, as fast as they could. We stayed there from May to October, and then we went to Jerome, Arkansas, and the barracks were much nicer, even though they still had the straw mattresses, the rough blankets, etc. But I preferred the relocation center.
You know, I know that the Tulare Fairgrounds was an assembly center, but it was, I think, an assembly center from April through September, and we were evacuated in August. It was getting close to the time when they were closing this as an assembly center. So we didn't have to stay here, but we went right, we were directed right to the trains and then onto the trucks. I do remember on the trucks, it was so hot that they gave us little canteens of water, and my dad had a handkerchief, and he was so worried that he would wet the handkerchief, and instead of drinking the water, he would put that wet handkerchief on my head, and it would just be dried in a second like this. So we were so relieved when we got to just some semblance of shade, which were the homes. But they were long barracks, and they had army blankets, and you know how thin an army blanket is, and so we just made partitions ourselves by hanging those army blankets down so that we would have some privacy. And I remember my dad, when he heard that people could go home, he wrote an article for our Post-Chronicle, which was a newspaper, and in it he said, just the privacy alone will be worth all it takes, and you will find citizens within your town that will accept you, but just the privacy alone will forbear you to have patience and wait for that growth. When we came home, there was it was different from home to Milwaukee to getting home again, and I remember going down through Cutler, and there was a no Japs wanted sign, and I was so young at that time, and it just embarrassed me to see that and read that very clearly, no Japs wanted. And I tried not to see it, and my father pointed it out saying, hey Nancy, Nanko, he called me, you see that sign? And I'm, yeah, I see it. And he said, boy, I wish I could get it And I said, why would you want that sign? And he said, because someday it's gonna be worth a lot of money.
Getting a lot of sponsors for your novel. I think one of the important things to remember about the assembly centers versus the incarceration camps is the speed at which these centers were constructed. Tulare, for instance, in April was when it first opened, but the executive order 9066 was mid-February. The actual decision to use the assembly centers happened in March. And so you had less than a month, really, that these assembly centers were being constructed and converted from fairgrounds, often racetracks like Santa Anita in Los Angeles, Turlock, Stockton County Fairgrounds. All of these places are being converted to horse stalls. My grandmother also remembered staying to these really poor conditions. One of my aunties remembered coming to Tulare and having porridge with bugs in it because the food provisions were just so rushed in and poor. While when they got to the purpose-built camps like Gila or Topaz or Poston or Jerome, there were often still very harsh conditions, but these were built from the ground up. These were purpose-built barracks, and as the people moved into them and lived in them for years, they had more opportunities to improve the conditions. So the food was still really, in a lot of cases, terrible to begin with, but many of these projects had farms attached to them, and the Japanese Americans in camp farmed and grew vegetables and were able to really have a lot of agency and ability to transform their conditions during their time there versus these assembly centers that they were in for such a brief period of time, which I think compounded the difficulties of the situation.
When we first went to our camp and they served us the meals, I remember that they served us boiled potatoes and mutton, and it was hot, and we had never had mutton, and so my mom said she turned to my dad and said, look, they don't know how to feed us. And my father said, we've got the best farmers in the world here, so we're going to grow our own food. And so that's what they did. They did have wonderful farmers there, and they did produce food growing right there in the middle of the desert. And they produced food and made their own seed. They made enough food that they sent it out and sold it for money, which then they were able to buy more seed for other crops.